Hey, good morning, everybody. Chris, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, hey.
I just sent you a message saying that you look familiar, but I can't place you.
Well, it is good to see you, and I hope all is well in your part of the world.
It is. Thanks.
Good. So, yeah, so I guess we're ready. I've got it recorded, and I guess you got John, Andrew, and Julia. Are they, have you checked they're in the room?
We are all set. Yes. So we're going to start with John Busenbark. He's an assistant professor at Notre Dame, and he is going to be talking about some novel data sources moving beyond words. So I'll turn it over to you, John, and then I'll be collecting questions, and I'll be, feeding you the questions after you're done with your presentation.
Okay, and Chris, I'll be in the room keeping an eye on things. If there's any problems or any questions, just reach out to me and we can get you the help.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate it. Chris, can you confirm if we can see the presentation on the screen and hear me okay?
I can see the presentation and I'm hearing you well.
All right, well, I think we know an N of 1 is perfect and applies to everybody, so we can move on from that. So thanks so much, Chris. Like Chris said, I'm John Busenbark. I'm coming to you from tropical South Bend, Indiana right now. It's beautiful here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, at a very high level, some trends in data sources and kind of variable operationalization, if I could say that word, that I've been noticing in strategy research over the past couple of years, especially as it relates to what reviewers are requesting through the review process. So in that way, I've done a couple of these in the past. I think this is my third or fourth, and this will be very different than what we typically do. Typically, we dive into some kind of complex or esoteric model, and this is going to be not that. This is kind of just like a compendium of potential tools. I provided a bunch of resources at the end of this in terms of references. So hopefully this kind of can help you point in a specific direction that might speak to your research. And unless this is challenging, and maybe Chris can tell me if it is, I would invite questions throughout the process. If something is pressing while we're talking about a specific data source, I'm happy to just address it while we're on the topic. Is that okay, Chris?
Yeah, that's fine with me. So normally people submit questions via the chat function. So if you don't mind, then I'll just interrupt you when I see a question.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so let's do that. So if anything pops up, feel free to ask, or we can wait till the end. It's totally up to you. So for those of you who do macro research at all, you've probably noticed that most studies draw data, historically at least, draw data from WORDS, which stands for Wharton Research Data Services. And within WORDS, there is like this exhaustive compendium of different databases. The popular ones are CompuStat and BoardX and ISS. My guess is that most of your institutions have access to the majority of these. You might not have ISS and BoardX because they both kind of get at the same type of board of director data, but you probably have one or the other. You might not have MSCI if you're not doing corporate governance or corporate social responsibility. Either way, you probably have access. And so because these are so prolific, historically we've seen them peppered throughout strategy research. And in terms of context, we've seen strategy scholars kind of derive their data from Thomson Reuters most often. So Thomson Reuters has data on acquisitions and IPOs and SEOs and some innovation and patent data. So kind of conventionally, these have been the bedrock of strategy research. And I think we have used them, we've exhausted them. They pop up in literally every study I do myself and I've read. And we kind of see them across a broad swath of research. So if you don't see your research stream listed here, I'm not going to go through all these, but this is just kind of a smattering of different domains where I've seen variables from all of those WORDS databases used as focal constructs, so independent, dependent variables, moderators, mediators, etc. So perhaps what's listed here shows my own bias in corporate governance, but we see it in innovation and firm performance research and work on dynamic capabilities and whatever you do, we're using words data. But interestingly though, and perhaps as a function, I review way too much. I probably review 4 or 5 papers a month, which is just a ridiculous number. But the benefit of doing that is I get to see what other reviewers are saying. And so I actually pulled 4 quotes here that I've seen this year alone. So just in 2020, I've seen scholars kind of talk about these data from words, from these conventional databases, and kind of just say, look, this data doesn't really move the needle for me. It doesn't really address what you're seeking to measure in a proximal enough way. I would really appreciate it if you describe something that's a little bit more connected to the variable that you're seeking to operationalize. And all of this was with respect to the data from words. They're pushing authors to try to find something a little bit closer, which for our micro colleagues is usually not an issue because they're doing surveys or experiments or something where they're gauging that directly. But we use kind of this like extremely distal proxy from some kind of financial statement. So with that in mind, I thought it might be helpful to put together a little list of trends in data that I've seen that address these reviewers' concerns directly. It's not to say that it's impossible to publish an article only using data from words, but it's becoming increasingly challenging. Whereas if you were to somehow incorporate data, especially for your focal variables, from one of the sources that I'll mention today, I think reviewers are a little bit more receptive because it's just inducing less measurement error. So if it's okay, I'll go through all the ones I've listed here, kind of describe some popular context for them, the sources, some benefits, and then areas for future directions for all of them. And so, like I said, feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions about any of these. I'm pretty familiar with them. And of course, this is not meant to be exhaustive at all. There are tons of really cool data that I don't mention here, but we have about a 20-minute presentation, so I tried to hit the highlights. So the first is analyst conference or earnings calls, which are totally interchangeable in my opinion. People call them earnings or conference calls. And what these are is top managers meet oftentimes quarterly with financial analysts, and they usually have a prepared presentation that they provide analysts, and then they answer for hours. Sometimes they answer analyst questions about what's going on in their firms. And this has become a really popular context for strategy research because we're able to see what managers are saying and thinking kind of in real time. So if in the past we might have used capital expenditures as a proxy to get at the extent to which managers care about new plants, in conference calls, we can actually listen to managers and they might say, hey, we're thinking about opening a plant here, and this is the number of resources we're going to commit to it, and this is why we're doing it. And so scholars have used this to look at how managers frame the information they provide to outsiders. So that could be what's called language style matching. Do they try to talk like one another, talk like the analysts? Use of concrete language, metaphors. There are all sorts of cool studies on the topic. And then some research has looked at what specifically are managers saying? What information do they think is most relevant to give to outsiders? So it speaks to what's on the top of their mind. And like I said, I've provided a ton of references in here, and then I provide the full references at the end if you're ever interested. The main sources for these earnings call data are Seeking Alpha, which is a free website. Most people use Python code to scrape Seeking Alpha conference calls. There's another website called Earnings Cast, and then just general corporate disclosures that you can find on Securities and Exchange Commission or the SEC websites. So some of the main advantages with these data are that they're real time. Although managers do prepare a short snippet about their general strategy and their thoughts, most researchers in the area look at the question and answer portion because that's a little bit less rehearsed. So you can see what managers are kind of thinking in real time. A challenge for this domain is that the data are extremely exhaustive. So if you pull these in, you'll have hundreds of gigabytes, if not terabytes, of text data, which are generally really small. There's just so much information. So you almost have to use automated text analysis to get at it, which has its own host of problems that I'll discuss later in the presentation. And it's also really hard with the current sources to look at temporal orderings. I have a ton of projects where I'm looking at how analysts prime what managers say, but it's kind of hard to get at who said what and then who responded to that and the sequence of exchanges in these. It's possible, it's just you have to write really sophisticated code to scrape that. All right, so another trend I've noticed, and this is the scope of the presentation. We're just going to go through data trends. I know it's at a really high level, but it's what was asked. The other trend I've noticed a lot is competitive actions. And so this is kind of getting at the same thing where in the past we might look at some financial indicators from financial statements, or we might dig into a 10K and see what managers talked about, or an annual report to see what managers talked about in terms of what their companies were doing. But recently, scholars have started to look at the actual competitive actions, timestamped down to the millisecond, to develop some really cool variables. So I've listed two here that I particularly appreciate. One is by Brian Connolly at Auburn, who is the incoming editor-in-chief at JOM, and he has this really interesting variable called competitive repertoire complexity, where they look at what the firm is doing in terms of its competitive initiatives. If there are like 11, I think there are 11 different categories that they use, and they look at how diverse the swath of competitive actions is. Do they use all 11, or are they kind of in one or two categories? They look at change over time and the number of new initiatives in any given year. There's another one that looks at aggressiveness by Connolly again, and Rindava and Aaron Hill has a really cool study on the topic, where they kind of look at how do firms respond to competitors, and how do they, to what extent do they kind of go overboard with their responses to rivals. And so these data are derived mainly from Dow Jones press releases, which are collated and categorized in many ways on a database called RavenPack. And what the data look like, what the RavenPack data look like is it's kind of a conventional panel data set where it has every firm listed for the number of press releases it gave in a specific period. And then each press release is timestamped down to at least a second, but maybe even the millisecond. And then RavenPack has all sorts of its own proprietary variables about the press release that, to be honest, aren't very good. So look at the sentiment of it and like the relevance of it. I don't know, nobody's really validated these. But one really valuable category in RavenPack is the classification of the action. So this is what researchers tend to use is how is the action classified among 11, I think it's somewhere between 8 and 11 different criteria. So they would classify acquisitions as one, new product introductions as another, plant expansions. They might look at seasoned equity or share repurchases as a category, things like that. And so the really interesting part of these data is that they're extremely comprehensive. We can know exactly what firms were doing and when, which for competitive dynamics research is great because it allows scholars to look between what actions and reactions, which is kind of the entire purpose of that literature stream. The main challenge with these data are that almost none of it's been extremely validated. We've kind of just colloquially accepted that these 8 or 11 categories are written in stone, but there hasn't really been much work to go through and determine whether or not these are actually different or the same, or if we should have more nuance or less nuance. Chris?
Yeah, John, we have a quick question from Mahish. He wants to know which of these data sources are available for free. Sorry, my cat is freaking out too.
No, I love it. I love the cat. Yeah, thanks, Mahish. That's a great question. And you know what? I should touch on that. And I'll try to, if I don't, remind me, I'll try to touch on that in all of these. So none, what a good cat. None of these ones for this one are free. If your institution subscribes to Factiva or LexisNexis, you can get this yourself. You can search on Factiva, is the easier one of the two, for press releases, and then categorize them yourself. That's a little bit more time consuming. What RavenPack does, is basically does that for you. So RavenPack takes it all from Dow Jones and categorizes everything and puts it in a nice, easy little template to read. The price of RavenPack is extremely variable. There's one rep for the United States, and what mood you catch them in will determine the price you pay for RavenPack. I think we pay a few $1,000s a year, a few $1,000s per year of data at Notre Dame, at least. Yeah, good question. All right. So the next trend, and this is something I've seen building a little bit more aggressively in recent years, and it has a longer history, and it's to look at what top managers or anybody in the organization is actually saying via what they write to outsiders. So a really popular one here is CEO letters to shareholders. CEOs every year, almost, I don't think it's legally mandated, but it might as well be because they all do it. They write, a 1 or 2 page little overview to all the shareholders, and these are publicly available. The same could hold true for press releases. All companies issue press releases quite often in their prepared written statements. Researchers have used these to look at what managers are actually kind of thinking, or maybe what their dispositions are. So a great example of this is CEO temporal orientation. Sucheta Nadkarni had a bunch of really, really interesting and really well done studies on this topic, where they looked at letters to shareholders mainly, and they used automated text analysis to determine whether or not the CEO is thinking in terms of the past, present, or the future. I realize I'm missing a comma in there. It's not present future, it's present or future. And they argue these are kind of trait characteristics. So what they can do is look at letters to shareholders over time and demonstrate how the CEO's orientation and that capacity hasn't changed as the same CEO has written the letter. Danny Gamache has some intriguing studies on regulatory focus, which look at promotion or prevention. Does the CEO or whoever's crafting a press release look toward new future opportunities that would be promotion, or kind of ensuring that the firm keeps its foothold in whatever it's doing? That would be prevention. Scholars have also looked at different kind of communication styles or behaviors. These data are free, which is great. Factiva is not free. If you want to get these from press releases, you have to subscribe to Factiva. But the main source for letters to shareholders is through the SEC. And the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, has a website called Edgar. So if you Google Edgar, just as I've written here, it should be the first, unless you have a weird Google history on your IP address of typing the word Edgar for something else, it should be the first one that pops up, but you could type SEC Edgar. And you can search this database till your heart's content. It has all documents and information about public companies. Chris?
Yeah, so we have a question about possible endogeneity issues with letters to shareholders.
Just, are there possible endogeneity issues? Oh, yeah, there are always, yes. Most of my methods research is on endogeneity, so I always think there are endogeneity issues. If it's okay.
Because your strategy.
Yeah, yeah. If it's okay, I actually have a slide at the end where we'll talk about measurement error and omitted variables and how we can address that with these databases. But yeah, what's interesting with the letters to shareholders that you bring it up here, so I'll actually talk about this in this context for a second, is most of the research that uses these, so if we're talking about temporal focus or regulatory focus, scholars would argue those are actual traits of individuals, and so they're not necessarily endogenous unless the CEO was selected on possessing those traits, which is a little bit of a tenuous argument, but it's an argument you can make. So in my experience, this specific data source, less than others, this one has not been battered over the head with concerns about endogeneity, but there's huge measurement error, which is basically the same thing, right? It's still unexplained variance in the error term. So you would get at it the same way, and we'll talk about that on the last slide. And if I didn't answer your question, or if you had something specific in mind, please let Chris know.
So another related point is about this measurement error issue and concerns about the extent to which these letters might be prepared by PR firms or marketing departments and not just the CEO.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is the main challenge to discuss about these letters to shareholders. So I was in an interesting panel discussion a few years ago at SMS. It was an SMJ editors panel discussion. So Craig Crossland, who is my colleague here at Notre Dame, and Jerry McNamara were two of the individuals on the panel. Jerry McNamara is a great scholar at Michigan State. And so Craig initiated this conversation, and he had said, in SMJ, we're pretty much done with letters to shareholders because of that reason, because we don't know who's preparing them. We would argue it's not the CEO. And, you know, if I'm editing a paper, I'm really not interested in seeing this. Jerry, on the other hand, disagreed with that fervently and suggested that the CEO at least has, in his experience, the CEO does at least craft the first draft and puts his or her stamp of approval on it. So it's still a reasonable tool to kind of get at what the CEO is thinking, or at least in terms of behavioral traits. And it's worth pointing out that Craig stepped down from that position, whereas Jerry is still an editor at SMJ. So if anything, you could probably lean towards doing this. But that's I don't really use this resource for that reason.
So then another related question is how you access these. So it says there's an Edgar API, but I don't think it includes the letter to the shareholders. Is there an easy way to scrape them?
Oh, yeah. Is there an easy way? If you're good at Python, at writing Python code, it's really easy. You could just write the code to access Edgar and scrape it. I've not done this myself. I have one project with Danny Gamache where we're using his letters to shareholders that he's used in other ones. But he told me he had a research assistant manually download everyone. I've written Python code to scrape the conference call data, which are much more challenging. So I don't think this would be too hard to do. And Edgar doesn't kick you out if you scrape, whereas Factiva would.
And then the last question for right now is whether or not there are parallel databases outside of the US.
Oh, good question. I actually don't know the answer to that, but if you want to, I think my email's on the first slide, but if not, it's on my website for sure. If you want to email me, I will look into that. I think that's interesting. I don't know outside the US if letters to shareholders are as popular as they are here. I would assume so. I've just never looked into that. That's a really, yeah. So email me and I'll figure it out for sure. Good questions. Okay. The next one is related. So I kind of put these, it's two different slides, but whereas most people who do letters to shareholders use automated text analysis, there's another form of content analysis that I've been a little bit more active in doing, which is manually reading, a host of scholars manually reading short snippets from financial statements, like certain portions of financial statements, to try to get at what those in the upper echelons are doing, or at least how they justify what they're doing. So a good example of this is Ryan Krause, and then Abby Oliver and I and Ryan built on a paper of his where we look at board chair orientations. So every year in a company's proxy statements, the board of directors has to write, it's like one paragraph about why they have selected to either have a dual CEO chairperson or a separate CEO chairperson, meaning there's a CEO and there's a chairperson of the board, then they have to justify that. So what we did was we literally, and it's just one paragraph, so we didn't have to use automated text analysis. We literally read all of them and coded them. We had like 500, so it wasn't too many, but we coded them on how they justified it on a couple different dimensions, what the orientation was. Another example is I looked at seasoned equity offerings, and in there, every company is mandated to give a list of reasons why they're issuing more equity in exchange for money from capital markets. So I looked at what are some of the reasons, which is something you could manually do. In my experience, the more you can manually do, the less measurement error. I've never gotten pushback in the review process from doing manual content analysis, and 100% of the time, no matter what validation procedure I do, I've gotten pushback on automated content analysis. And there's another really, this is like my favorite study right now. It's by Hoberg and Phillips. where they look at 10K's annual reports, and they read it to see what rivals are mentioned in the 10Ks, and they reason, which I think is reasonable, for lack of a better word. They argue that if managers are mentioning rivals in those 10Ks, those are probably the primary rivals of the firm. So they use that to get a closer set of competitors rather than using industry definitions, which is so cool. I'm trying to work that into basically everything I'm doing these days. Once again, these are all available for free from Edgar. So when I did the board chair orientations paper, I literally went to Edgar, searched every firm, and then typed in DEF 14A, which is the name of the proxy statement. If you want to do annual reports, which I've also done, it would be 10K. And you can download all of them. I downloaded all of them in HTML format because I scraped it, so it was much easier to scrape it in HTML format. For those of you who like to scrape, I use Python. The code is pretty easy. There are a ton of advantages to this approach. Like I said, there's not as much measurement error, which we'll talk about, as there would be with automated text analysis. Of course, once again, we don't know who crafted the statement. My guess is for annual reports, there's a team of communications professionals who does that. So it would be tenuous, I think, to argue that an annual report represents what managers are thinking, but you could at least use it to indicate what the firm broadly is thinking about. And they're highly regulated. So 99.9% of these statements are total boilerplate. You'll see the same paragraphs identically pop up across every firm because it's just kind of legalese. So you have to have something in mind. Like, I wouldn't just download the whole report and scrape it or use automated text analysis. You have to pick out little snippets here and there. Another one, I think this is the second to last one we'll discuss, but there's something called video metrics, which is really new. I've not done this at all. I bought a TV for my office, like a big one, with the intent of doing this, and then I just got sidetracked. But I have some great friends who publish in this area. What video metrics means is literally watching videos of people speaking, usually in strategy, it's top managers, and coding their mannerisms and behaviors to try to get at attitudinal constructs. So there's an article in a research methods book that Aaron Hill and Oleg Petrenko, who are the main two scholars doing this in strategy, those two and colleagues put together, where they validate looking at personality characteristics of top managers by watching published interviews of them. So they would maybe, like, let's say they're interested in Tim Cook from Apple. They would download all these video interviews that Tim Cook has done on CNBC or CNN or Bloomberg or Fox Business or whatever it is. And they have scales they've developed to get at top big five personality, narcissism and humility, and also positive and negative affect, which are so cool because that's kind of speaking with their micro colleagues a little bit there. The main benefit of this is that we can pretty much never get at kind of traits, behaviors, or trait characteristics of top managers in the way that OB scholars would do. Typically, they would give surveys or maybe do experiments or something to get at these. Unless your name is Jim Westfall, it is impossible to get top managers to do that. Jim has I don't know, he sends surveys to CEOs and they fill them out, which is amazing. I don't know, he's so lucky in that way. But none of the rest of us can do that. So this is just an unobtrusive way to kind of get at that. And it's very well validated. These researchers did it for just regular people like you and me. They did video metrics and then had the people fill out the conventional surveys and found out that they were very highly related. A huge future direction from this is that this is pretty much all that's been done in the area are the three topics I highlight at the top of the slide here. So if you're interested in anything else you could learn from watching a top executive, I think there's a lot of runway there in this research domain. I had a doctoral student. I used to be at University of Georgia, and I had a doctoral student there named Rob Campbell, who's at Nebraska now, who was doing this with humorousness. So they were having coders rate how funny the CEO is in interviews and whether that matters, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know what happened to that study, but there's a lot of room for stuff like that. A huge challenge, though, is that you're limited to a really small sample of executives who have a sufficient number of published interviews that you can access online. And I don't know what the sample size is on that, but I'm positive if you look at the Hill et al. 2019 paper, they will discuss that at length. And then finally, the last topic that has been gaining steam now since probably Deep House 2000 wrote an article on this, and then it's becoming really popular in recent years, is conventional and social media. So by conventional media, I'm talking about all the professional media outlets that you see. In strategy research, we oftentimes limit it to kind of the top 5. I'm sure journalists would take exception to that, but top 5 for what we do, which is Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Forbes, Fortune, and Washington Post, I think are the ones that basically everybody uses. Maybe New York Times, and not Fortune, but it's in the studies I mentioned here, they talk about all of those. And essentially what scholars are interested in doing are looking at what are the perceptions of organizational events. And so they use media tenor and all the text from media to determine how outsiders evaluate what a company is doing. And then there's also some research on how the media can shape what the company does. So how does the extent to which the firm has been treated favorably in the past, or the type of coverage that a firm has received in the past, how does that shape what a firm does? And there are, the media is a great information intermediary to study that kind of has a non-financial impetus. So there are tons of future directions in this regard. These data, the conventional media data, are almost always gathered from Factiva, where you can limit the search to specific news outlets and then search by company and date and just download all the media for these. Typically what people do is you can download the entire corpus of media attention per observation in one document, and then they can scrape that whole document, which just gives it kind of one score on one line in the data. And then social media has just started gaining steam in the literature. I think Kim and Hume 2017 was the first study to really get at this with an empirical basis. There's been a lot of theoretical speculation. I think that was the first empirical study, and almost always that involves scraping Twitter, which is doable. It's not extremely easy, but it's definitely doable. So they scrape Twitter for mentions and hashtags about companies and their sample. Obviously there are a ton of huge advantages to this. It gets at a stakeholder that we almost would never otherwise talk about. It can kind of describe how outsiders perceive what a company is doing. To me, the biggest challenge with this data, and it's data that I've published on myself, is that the media and even social media to an extent are negatively valenced, meaning they're predisposed to take a negative perception of the firm. You probably heard the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, the media is concerned about negative aspects of the firm. Almost always, this research looks at how the media responds to unfavorable violations that the firm has. So if something is negative, how negatively does the media cover it, and what can managers do to prevent that? Okay, so with that in mind, Chris, was there a question?
Yeah, there's a question about human subjects boards and the extent to which, I guess in your experience, IRBs consider this kind of data of using public media sources of an individual as being human subjects data.
Yeah, that's a great question. So at Georgia and Notre Dame, when I've done this was not considered under the purview of the IRB. We asked once for social media, and basically the response we got was no, because it's all online, and so it's all public information, as long as we're not linking it back to specific individuals. So we don't, for the social media, I've never seen it, and I have never personally coded it to a specific person, or even kept a random identifier for specific people. For press, it's just not an issue. Your IRB might disagree with that statement, so I'm definitely not an IRB expert. Just when I've asked before, I've been told it's not a problem. Good question. Okay, so finally, and we alluded to this earlier, the challenges with all of these types of data are omitted variables, basically, or I should say unexplained heterogeneity, which refers to If you think about just like a general linear regression model, you have y equals, you know, beta 1 plus beta 2 plus beta 3, and then the error term. And unexplained variance in the error term is a problem when it's correlated also with the independent variable. So oftentimes we use these cool proximal measures to try to get at some independent variable. So if we're interested in the CEO's narcissism, we might watch a video of the CEO and code for narcissism. Of course, that doesn't totally capture the CEO's narcissism, right? It's not a perfect measure, which means there's measurement error. And if part of that measurement error is picking up another construct that also influences the dependent variable, that's an issue. And the same with omitted variables. If there's some other construct that's influencing what we're seeking to study and also influences the dependent variable, that's a problem. That's omitted variable bias. Semideni et al. 2014 is the go-to, in my opinion, the gold standard for these two topics, and they discuss how to address them with two-stage instrumental variable techniques. I have papers on that. It's an exhaustive topic. That said, there's another way to at least try to eliminate measurement error, and that's through a good validation process. So Aaron McKenney, who's now at Indiana, and Herman McGinnis and a bunch of their colleagues published a paper in 2016, and it's called something like "What's Not Measured Does Exist." And so it's all about measurement error using these kind of text or novel data sources. And throughout the process of an entire article, they go through different ways to validate measures and dictionaries and things like that to try to eliminate or at least minimize measurement error. So that's a good place to start, and a lot of us have used the procedure they have delineated. Yeah, Chris.
Oh, I just wanted to let you know you have about 2 minutes left.
Perfect, because we are done. There's that. And, oh, and I should say, all these references are in here. So if I'll just kind of leave it on this for a second in case you want to look at the uploaded video. You can pause it, and everything cited in here is there.
So there is one final question, which is about your view on mixed methods.
Yeah, so mixed methods always good. And stated bluntly, at this point we are trying to do not formal multiple study research, but to the extent that we can add in an experiment, especially with these kind of data, it's super helpful. So I have a paper right now with Marie Mitchell at Georgia, and Sucheta Nadkarni was on the paper as well. Unfortunately, she has passed. But we're doing that. So we're looking at conference call data, and then we're also doing an experiment to help determine what the extent to which our conference call data are accurately picking up what we think they are.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting and informative. And so I think you're posting your slides or sending them?
Yeah, they're different. I'm not sure how to post them, so what I'll do is email them to the organizers. And,
okay, yeah. That sounds great. All right, well, thank you so much. We're going to turn it over now to Andrew Knight, who is a professor at Washington University, and he is going to be talking to us this, my morning, but I guess other people's other times, about using web-based meetings as a research tool.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Excellent.
And see your slides, so.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the time this morning. I'm delighted to share some in-progress work with you that I hope could be useful for some of the projects that you have going on right now. So I'm going to take some time this morning and just give a little bit of a background on the project itself, but then I'm going to dig into some of the technical details and provide some suggestions for how you could use some resources to do research on web-based meetings, which we're all spending a lot of time in right now and probably will be going forward. As we're going forward, please do shout out questions. I'm happy to answer questions throughout the stream, especially as we're going through maybe some of the more technical components. If you have any specific questions, I'm happy to address them, and I've got the chat window open right in front of me so that I can see your question. So just to give you a little bit of sense of the purpose, the background behind this project. So my colleagues and I have been working on developing some resources for studying web-based meetings. And really what we're doing is just compiling a lot of different things and trying to package them into a single usable resource that gives the kind of information often that people want when studying web-based meetings. And there are a couple of reasons why we're doing this. Even before COVID-19, we were seeing a shift increasingly for knowledge work towards virtual meetings. But without question, COVID-19 has accelerated this shift and is going to increase both the need for researchers to better understand the kinds of things that lead to effective virtual interactions, but also with the other hat that many of us wear, the need for us to give our students good developmental guidance for how they can collaborate effectively with others through a virtual medium. I teach a course called People Metrics. It's in our analytics and MBA program. And in that course, students regularly send and talk about some of the novel ways that they're interacting with corporations, whether that's through job interviews or through their internships. And so many students are experiencing things like interviews with AI. And so if we can't give good guidance for folks on how to navigate those situations, then we're going to fall behind the times. And that was really the impetus behind this project. From a research perspective, and so predominantly my research focuses on group dynamics, how people interact with one another in small groups and teams. And for me, virtual meetings present an incredibly rich source of data that we could potentially use in order to study problems that have been very challenging to study in the past. Oh, we've got a child in the background. I don't think that's on my end. If you're not muted, go ahead and mute yourself, unless you've got something to contribute, or maybe if your child has something to contribute.
Ja jestem na seminarze od 16. Jeszcze jest godzina.
Sorry, if you could go ahead and just mute yourself. Thanks. So virtual meetings, if you think about the different channels that come through, we have spoken language, we have written language, we have nonverbal visual signals, we have nonverbal auditory signals. And these, I would argue, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is really the things that are most evident when you are experiencing an interaction with others through a virtual medium. My interest in this aligns with a longer interest in using less obtrusive methods. This is just a quote from my favorite research methods book from more than 50 years ago, just highlighting the potential for using less obtrusive methods in order to study interpersonal phenomena, but also to complement some of the methods that we do regularly use. And so I would suggest that the tools that I'm offering are not a substitute for the tools that we currently use, but they're potentially a really valuable complement that can help us circumvent problems, for example, of repeated measures within small groups. It's really taxing to administer a single survey multiple times, and yet we're often very interested in the flow of things over the course of time. And so my hope is that some of these methods in studying virtual meetings, we can better capture and understand true dynamics as opposed to more static snapshots of interactions among people within groups. The big picture of this project, and I'll speak this morning to just a small snippet of the project, but the larger project aims are to first and foremost develop a process to unobtrusively collect data from virtual meetings. I'm going to focus today specifically on Zoom, although some of these resources could be applied to other types of virtual meetings. A second objective is to validate measures of teamwork and leadership that are less obtrusive, that are based on virtual interactions. And then a third component, which doesn't speak directly to our time today, but is an objective, is to build a dashboard to give meeting participants rapid cycle feedback so that they can alter and adjust their behavior. From a research perspective, that could be interesting because it opens the door to potentially to quasi experiments, to field experiments in order to nudge and adjust and change people's behavior in the course of virtual interactions. and then looming throughout this project, and something I think that across many different domains, we're thinking a lot about policies and practices around data ethics and privacy. And so as we are, for example, right now interacting with one another, there are some really interesting questions around data capture. What's public, what's private? If someone is screen capturing this interaction currently and capturing my face and other people's faces on video, what can we do with that information? And so that is an additional component that runs throughout every part of this project, is thinking through and refining processes and policies on data ethics and privacy. But let's dive in. Let me make this a little bit more concrete. And I'm going to focus on two components of this in our time as a stimulus for discussion. And so please don't hesitate to stop me. It's okay if we don't get through all of this. I've put resources up online to provide some additional guidance. And so it's okay if we don't get through all of it. I would much rather have a discussion, something that's driven towards the hunger and needs that you have for your own work. The two channels that I'm going to focus are on opportunities for analyzing video feeds and opportunities for analyzing language that comes across. And so I'm using the vague term language here because we have both spoken word, what I'm doing right now, as well as we have the chat that is flowing. And so we've got spoken language and we have written language that's coming across, and we have opportunities to analyze that. The package of resources, if you would like to check this out yourself now, it is available online. And so this is nothing more than a collection of R functions currently that pull together some different resources to try to process information from Zoom-based meetings. And so if you go to the website apnight.org, you can see, I think the first post there still has the set of functions. Or if you wanted to start playing around with it right now, you could just include the statement in your R code, and it'll pull in those different functions. I'm going to give an overview of some of the functions that are included here, but as let me pull the code over and just let you take a peek at it. So it is fairly extensively commented throughout. And so again, if we don't get through something today, it is available online, and I tried to give good directive comments throughout here. As you can see, though, this is in progress work. And so please, as you're using this, or if you are using this, and you run into any difficulties, if you run into any bugs, please do let me know. There's a classic software development line that with many eyes, all bugs are shallow. And so if you see something, please do speak up, let me know, and we can make a change. Similarly, if you see a way to improve or add additional features and you want to work with me, collaborate on something, I'm always open to that as well. Here is the first component of this that I'll speak to in our time today, and that's opportunities for analyzing video feeds. And I'm just going to play a video here in the slides. This is an old video from Affectiva that just gives a little bit of a sense of some of the different kinds of applications that are in use, that are available for us, available for researchers, available for consumers to use. And so the availability of this technology truly is, it's more at our fingertips than it ever was before. And so I think that opens really interesting opportunities for us to start incorporating that into our own research. I'll just give you one good example of that, which is AWS recognition, something that you've probably seen in the news over the past week with Amazon restricting access to recognition from local governments and police departments. Recognition is an available and accessible consumer technology for doing a lot of things when it comes to analyzing video feeds. And so in line with our best practices on data ethics and privacy, here's a small group. This is just my kids here. And so in developing some of this and testing some of this, I've just used my own children to create a little Zoom group that we can analyze. and I bark out orders to them and ask them to display different facial expressions. And I want to give you a sense of how we could move from something like the Zoom interaction that we're having currently to a usable data set. And so bear with me, always risky to do demos in the course of a Zoom meeting, but I'll give it a try. And again, if you have questions as we're going through, let me know. In this short bit of code that I have up, I'm just going to show you, I'm not going to walk through each component of it because it is commented, but I want to give you a sense of what you would get out. And so here, if I had a video recording of our Zoom interaction, so if we clicked record, or we have clicked record, we can access a video file. And this current function that's in Zoom Group Stats, video face analysis, this is just a really, really crude way of analyzing the affect that is in process in the course of our interaction. And so literally what it's doing is it's just going to sample out at whatever level of temporal resolution you supply. And so here I'm saying, go through the video every 30 seconds, take a snapshot, take a frame of what's happening in that interaction. And so it would look something like what you see on the screen here. And then it's going to analyze that. That frame. And so if I were to show you what it looks like, this is just the top 6 rows. It's going to give you a couple of things. First, it's giving you a timestamp for that interaction. So it pulled out a slice at 5:56, 34 seconds. And then it uses facial recognition in order to try to identify each person that's in the frame. And so there's some background here that you'd need to set up if you wanted to use the identity detection component. For me, it identified each of my kids, but I had not put my identity in, and so it labeled me as identity not recognized. And so first thing it could do is that. I'll say a little more about that towards the end. You can see for each of these things, because these algorithms are, these are probabilistic algorithms, it gives you an indication of confidence. How confident am I that this is indeed Oliver, my middle son? How confident am I that it's Emil? And so in my experience so far, if you supply enough sample images of who you want it to detect, it can be quite good if it has a really big, a good bank of photos of that person. Then you see the kind of information that this algorithm will give you just by default. And I would highlight it's really important to take this information with a grain of salt. And I'll say more about validation towards the end. These are consumer tools. These are tools that are available broadly, and so they may not meet our level of tolerance for validity and accuracy. And so that's something important to keep in mind. But you get everything from an estimate of someone's age range. And so it estimated me between 19 and 31. It estimated my middle son between 13 and 23. And so you get an estimate of age range. You get some indications of what's happening in the photo. Is the person smiling, wearing eyeglasses, sunglasses? We get an estimate of gender. Now what's interesting here, my middle son Oliver has really long hair, and so it estimates that my middle son is female. Gives an other facial attributes are given, and then you get, if you're interested like I am in emotional dynamics within groups, we get this bank of discrete emotions. And so at every snapshot in time, it's going to give an indication of how confident is the algorithm that that participant is displaying that particular emotion. So this can be something valuable for complementing other methods that you might be using to access a more continuous stream of emotional expression data than you might get if you were breaking into the group every 30 seconds and saying, fill out this survey, fill out this survey, fill out this survey. Similarly, this is far more efficient than if you were having RAs coding this video stream. However, we are presented obviously with the really important question around around validity of these emotional expression markers. That's something critical that we need to resolve. But it is potentially a powerful tool that we have in our toolbox. Chris, your question, are confidence and intensity related? What do you mean there?
So so it sounded to me like you were saying that what it's giving you is a degree of confidence, for example, that someone's confused. And so my question is so for example, with happiness, is it that the more intensely I look happy, the more confident it is that I'm happy?
So there is a signal strength component to this, where if the signal is a really strong one, if your expression matches how human-based coders have coded expressions of happiness in the past, then you're going to get a higher level of confidence associated with that. And so ultimately, these algorithms are driven and based around human-based codings. And so it's if humans would perceive a more intense expression of happiness with more confidence as indeed happiness, then you're going to get the same thing from the algorithm. Follow-up comment: do we have to separate media savvy folks from novice? This is really the same problem that we would face with almost any measurement approach, is that we have questions around faking, we have questions around authenticity, we have questions around the match between what we are saying we're measuring and what we're actually measuring. And so, for example, if I were to include this in a paper and I was to say that I was measuring participants' levels of happiness, there is a huge assumption there that participants are actually expressing the emotional feeling that they have underneath. And so this is where I think there's value in having folks who are management and organizations researchers using these tools to clarify a lot of the ways that these are being misused. And so that is something that is important to consider. Question around discrete emotions. Can this be expanded to complex emotions such as shame or envy? It could be expanded. And so this is the default technology that you could get if you used recognition. Recognition is constantly being updated. However, you yourself could train an algorithm. If you wanted to try to measure shame or envy, those are going to be more difficult things to measure. However, you could certainly train your own algorithm to try to do that. That would be beyond what comes by default. So let me press forward. This is a good first example, though, of what you might be able to get just from what you could download for a group, from a group. Moreover, this is something that you don't need Zoom to do this, and so you could take any MP4 if you have recordings of groups interacting with one another in your lab, and you wanted to use recognition in order to analyze those recordings that you have. That is certainly something that you could do. All this short bit of code does is just takes your video, samples snapshots, and sends them up to the Amazon cloud, sends the facial markers, the metadata of the images, and has those coded. A couple of notes here on what you would need to use this, and I promise you that this is not as daunting. Even if you are not tech savvy, this is not as daunting as it might seem at the outset. What you would need to use this particular technology is an AWS account with privileges for the recognition service. And so I mentioned earlier that we've seen recognition in the news lately, and this is something that we are seeing public conversation around the use of these technologies, the potential misuse of these technologies. And so I would certainly expect that IRBs, rightfully so, will be increasingly critical of how these are used and what kind of information you're sending into the AWS cloud. The second opportunity I think that exists, and this is one that I am even more excited about because it streamlines and makes far more efficient something that we do currently. We see streams of research that analyze language. We see streams of research that analyze conversations. But if you've ever done this, it's really, really labor intensive. It's very taxing. And so conducting virtual meetings provides the opportunity for doing this in a less obtrusive way and a more efficient way. And so there are opportunities for written language. That's the chat. And so if we just take a look at our chat right now, and if you mouse over the chat, you see there's a timestamp for every message. There's an identity for every person. And then there's the content of speech, the content of what the person is contributing. When it comes to spoken language, this was one of my delightful surprises in working with Zoom, is that if you choose to record to the cloud, and if you're, for example, my university's institutional account has rights to record to the cloud, when you do that, you can get an automatically generated transcript. And so this is what a transcript from a Zoom call looks like. And so you see it has the same information as what's in the chat. However, it's based on an automatic transcription of our audio interactions with one another. And it often is quite good at capturing the audio interactions that we have. And so you see there is a breakdown of the stream of conversation into utterances. Each one of those utterances has a start time and an end time down to microseconds. And then it has the identity of the contributor and the content of speech. So this is something that if we were to do this manually, this is going to be very taxing. This is the start of one of my web classes from this spring. And so what we've been doing is just building tools to make it easier to get the information that we might want out of whether that's the chat or the spoken language, to parse that information and package that information to hopefully measure some of the things that we commonly measure. For me, my interest is in small group dynamics, and so I'm interested in who communicates when, how much do they communicate. Do they choose to communicate through the text chat? Do they choose to speak up and contribute verbally? The content of what they're saying. What are they talking about over the course of the meeting? How are they contributing to the affective tone of the meeting? And so what's the tone of their communications? And there is much, much more that we could do with the information that's coming across verbally or through the text chat. So let me give you an example of this. So there are functions in the Zoom group stats file that's online. One of them just processes the transcript. I'll focus on transcripts. Chat works the exact same way as transcript. And so first we would process the transcript from a Zoom interaction. What that gives you is it gives you just the parsed data. It gives you a column, a variable with someone's identity for that utterance, the start time, the end time, the content of the communication. Then there's a function for analyzing the conversation. So analyzing the flow of contributions over the course of the meeting. And what this gives, it gives two things. It gives a group level of analysis, kind of picture of, if we just summarize and look across the group, how do things look? And then currently it gives a speaker level of analysis. Now, you could further take this, and this is what we're working on doing, is breaking this out into slices or windows of time over the course of the meeting. But here's what a group level of analysis gives you. It gives you total recorded time, how many utterances were there. So if you focus down here, how long are people speaking? How long are people quiet? There's a measure of burstiness, which was a metric used in a paper recently by Rydell and Woolley for analyzing the conversation within groups. It gives you a sentiment analysis. And so on average, what's the percent of positive utterances, the percent of neutral, mixed, or negative utterances? And so that's just very coarse group level of analysis. But now we could also look at the individual level. And so if we took a look at the individual level, each one of these rows is a person. And so this is an analysis of my 90-minute class, I think, something like that. 90-minute class that I ran. And so, you know, just in terms of face validity, as the faculty member, this is how much time I spent talking. This is a problem. And for meeting feedback, this is maybe a good indicator saying, hey, you're consuming too much airtime, quiet down. So you can get this indication of just what piece of the conversation pie is someone biting off. Then you can get other helpful things like what is someone's speaking segment length? So when someone speaks, when they contribute to the group, how long do they go on before offering or before someone else takes the opportunity to come in and speak? Then this is, again, across the entire meeting. This is a sentiment analysis of people's contributions. And that sentiment analysis uses an AWS and Amazon service called Comprehend. And so it's just taking each utterance and having each utterance sentiment analyzed. But because of what you get from the transcript or from the chat, because you're getting each of the messages, you could take that file and use it with whatever text analysis software you prefer. And so if you want to use Luke on it, you know, you could do so. If you wanted to use a different sentiment analysis engine, you could do so. Or if you wanted to train your own. And so similarly, AWS has a nice text analysis feature where you can train your own algorithm. But of course, to do that, you would need humans to go through and code that this person was narcissistic, for example. So that's an example of what you could do on the transcript side, as well as what you could do with the chat. A couple of notes for these. In the slides, I've just featured a couple of the functions here that you might use with either the output of a Zoom meeting or more generally. And so the first set of functions is really just parsing. These are just going through and parsing the output that you get from Zoom. Then these over here, senti out, just does a sentiment analysis of text, and the conversation analysis is what gives you an indication of some of these other metrics. Question is, can you also get the transcripts of spoken language for face-to-face meetings recorded in the lab? The answer to that is yes. So there is, AWS does provide a pretty good transcription service. The caveat here, and this is something that I'm working to resolve right now, the caveat is that you don't get that nice identification of identity. And so the identification component, who is it that's speaking? That's something that still is a little bit cumbersome. Moreover, just share my own experience with you is I'm right now collecting data on 68 teams meetings. People aren't terribly conscientious all the time at using the appropriate or using their correct identifier in their Zoom name. And so if we were to just take a look at the gallery view in our meeting right now, I have my first and last name. Sherry just has Sherry's first name. Someone else has an email address. And so there are some logistical components here as you start to think about creating a clean data set that is correctly identified to the person who's contributing. There are still some hurdles and steps there that we need to overcome. The second big challenge in addition to identity, so far I have not found a very good way with Zoom in particular to sync up the multiple data streams. And so one of the challenges I've found is I believe the chat transcript, the typed in chat, that clock starts when someone first contributes, or maybe starts when the meeting begins. The recording, the transcript clock starts when someone clicks record. And so if we were to start the recording now, we would have out of sync data streams. And so there are some, I think, real challenges still around the temporal component of this and making sure that our data are clean, that they're identified to the right people, and that they are synced up over the course of time. Those are all parts that are still a bit manual to resolve. Here are some things that are on the horizon for this project. And again, if you have interest in contributing or working on problems like this, I'm always open to working with folks. One is just the validation effort. And so we have a project in process right now where we're collecting survey data to go along with these Zoom-based metrics to try to understand if we might be able to validate measures, unobtrusive measures of things like leadership and influence, different types of conflict, as well as markers of meeting effectiveness. We're also at the same time developing a feedback platform that I mentioned before to give people insights into how they participate and how they engage in meetings. And so something as simple as saying, hey, it was a 60-minute meeting and you spoke for 45 minutes of that time. And there were 5 people there. So things like that, we're curious if we can nudge and change people's behavior to help them contribute in a more effective way to the meetings that they're a part of and the meetings that they lead. And then finally, some extensions, integrating content analysis. So not just analyzing the sentiment or the tone of someone's contributions, but what is it that they're speaking about? What is the content of their contribution? And even something as simple as classifying content into being relatively more task-based or relatively more relational, that would be one direction that could be promising. And then integrating Pratt. Pratt is software for analyzing audio. And so one of the other files that I didn't speak about today, but it's embedded in the video, is you get a straight audio file based on the meeting. And so we could also analyze characteristics of people's speech. And there are fascinating streams of literature on how people change and vary their speech contributions, and how those also can be indicators of things like influence and status. And so I'll close with a final thought and leave some time for questions. And my final thought, I actually think, is the most important one. Whether it's video-based meetings, regardless if you're using a novel measurement approach, if you're using a novel data set, do not presume plug-and-play validity. Just because it comes from a big company full of smart people like Amazon, we cannot presume that these measures are valid. We cannot presume that these measures don't systematically under-detect or over-detect certain kinds of phenomena. And so, wonderful example, and someone who has been all over the media over the past week is Joy Buolamwini from the Algorithmic Justice League. She's an MIT grad and researcher who specifically focuses on systematic bias in algorithms. And so AWS recognition, Microsoft, et cetera, these are all ones that she has tested in her work and shown systematic under-detection, in particular of female faces and faces of people of color. And so we cannot presume plug-and-play validity. We've got to do the hard work of validation. And then the final thing is, especially when it comes to data that can be collected unobtrusively, that is capturing someone's face and voice and likeness, we need to have enhanced scrutiny of data security and privacy, and that is I think a challenging place that not just researchers but also corporations more broadly are going. So I'll stop here and address any questions that folks have about either this technology or broader applications of studying web-based meetings.
There was an earlier question about dealing with IRB for this type of data.
So like most things IRB, this would be highly dependent upon your own institution's IRB. I am routinely surprised at the variability across, even in my own institution, across IRB reviewers. And so some folks might not bat an eye, and they may view this the same as recording a lab-based study that you run right there on campus. Others, especially if that morning they heard an NPR story about Amazon recognition, might have enhanced scrutiny of this information. What I would suggest is, as a good starting point, start with whatever the basic policies and practices are around recordings. around making video recordings, because the video recording has the transcript embedded. It's all information and it's all there. Similarly, the video recording has the audio, it has the visual depiction. And so I would start with that as a good initial point. And my guidance would be to open a conversation with your IRB staff and reviewers early on in a project. Be proactive in asking them what their guidance would be for handling this information, because I suspect that if you just send it over, you're going to get probably more of a gut reaction to something, as opposed to if you open the dialogue and conversation, you're probably going to help them refine their own policies around using a Zoom recording that may not fit with what their practices had been in the past.
Another question was about the availability. It says, due to the availability of analysis tools, should we plan to do interviews via video rather than in person? And are there any negatives we should be aware of when moving our in-person interviews to tech-based?
So one of the things that I would consider you or encourage you to consider is external validity. And so there are things that are easier to do over a screen. Some of this transcription, for example, just because it's flowing through and being marked. However, there are also things that are very difficult to do. And so let's say that you are doing an interview-based study that focuses on suffering. It may be really important for you as the interviewer to develop a sense of trust, a sense of rapport with someone, and that might be far more difficult to do through a camera and through a screen. And so I think I would really carefully think about what are your research objectives, and to what extent does the medium that you're using align with and advance those research objectives. But I wouldn't just go based on what's easiest to do technically, because we've been doing in-person recordings and dealing with the problem of transcription for a long time, and I think that's a very solvable problem. I wouldn't just go with what is going to be strictly most efficient.
You actually have a ton of additional questions. I'm going to ask you one other one, and then I'll just ask you to I'll kind of earmark the ones that we didn't get to, and perhaps you can just answer them online. So the last question is about how do you ensure and check the validity of these newly developed measures?
Our good old-fashioned measure validation processes apply. And so although this is fancy new technology, the same problems around validation are there. And so that means that we need to think carefully about what our measurement model is. What is the construct that we're trying to measure, and be really precise in defining that construct. Thinking about everything from face validity to convergent validity, discriminant validity, making sure we're assessing reliability, thinking about how dynamic the construct is. And so I would just say, go back to the classics of measure validation and use those basic principles, even if it's a new technology. All of those good old-fashioned tools are still applicable and still valuable.
Great. Well, so I will send you the additional questions that you didn't get a chance to answer. We had just apparently a lot of interest in this topic. Thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate it. Very interesting.
Thanks, everyone.
So next up, we have Julia DiBenigno, who is at Yale. She's an assistant professor there, and she's going to be talking to us about managing data collection challenges during fieldwork. So Julia, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I'm excited to be here. And let's see, I'm trying to share my screen. It's saying I can't share when another participant's sharing. So I think, Andrew, if you're able to unshare, then I'll add on here. Let's see. All right. Let's see. Great. Can you all see and hear me okay and see the screen? Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I love talking about data methods and data collection in particular, and it was great to learn from Andrew and John before this. And I'm also open to questions throughout as well. I want to make sure I can see the chat. Okay, I can't. All right, so I will just dive in, and I might count on you, Chris, to flag any questions for me. And I did not have to teach virtually in the spring, and so I don't have a lot of experience giving virtual presentations, so this is good practice for me. So I'd like to talk to you about common challenges I've experienced in the different field studies I've conducted, and I wanted to start by sharing my own approach as an organizational ethnographer. So the approach I take is to really try to find an important problem in the world, and then one that existing organizational theory doesn't have a good solution to. So I think of myself almost as like a puzzle finder and puzzle solver, where I'll immerse myself in a field site, an environment, and then figure out, what are puzzles and real problems and tension points to the people in the place I'm studying that we don't already have good answers to. So there's a little bit of making sure with this approach you're not reinventing the wheel by discovering in-group out-groups or discovering things that we already know a lot about. So it's this inductive, abductive as well process of finding puzzles and then engaging with the literature, and then really importantly making sure while you're in the field and early in the field you're making good strategic decisions to make sure you have sufficiently rich and detailed enough data to say something about addressing those puzzles. The goal being to uncover novel explanatory mechanisms that can inform theory and practice. So I've done this in a few projects. My first in graduate school was a year-long ethnography of a hospital studying nurses and patient care technicians, where I dressed in scrubs and did day and night shifts and immersed myself there, and have written about professional identity and cross-occupational collaboration. For my dissertation, I studied mental health care delivery in the US Army. I'm going to go in kind of a deep dive around the challenges I encountered in that data collection process and some of the lessons learned. And then I'm currently finishing up a new project understanding dynamics around the politics of inclusion and a group-based approach to understanding workplace harassment. And then I've, since COVID, have been part of a team at Yale studying a hospital's response to all the disruption that COVID has brought. And that has been meaningful work, but also really challenging methodologically, because all the relationships are virtual from the start. There was no in-person relationship building, and everyone we've talked to is either over Zoom or the phone. And so I'd also be happy if there's time at the end to talk about some of the things we're learning there. And I'm excited to share with the team I'm a part of what Andrew just presented about some of the access we have there. Let's see. Okay. Great. And then a little bit more on my approach. So as I was mentioning before, once you've figured out what those central puzzles are that are intriguing and important to the site that you're embedded within, it is shifting to make sure you're focusing your data collection to get enough data to say something, and thinking this is often taking time out after being in the field for a few months to reflect, write memos, and write what I'd call theory memos around stopping and saying, like, what would the existing literature predict would occur given these dynamics, to understand, do you have an extreme or unique case where the literature would actually predict success but you see failure, or vice versa, or you're seeing across different settings or types of people the same kind of process. I've also employed this idea of a matched case design, so thinking about, once you have an understanding of your setting, are there really comparable units that are otherwise very similar but that are going in different directions, or things like that you could try to isolate and have better support for any kind of explanatory mechanism that you're seeing. And the focus here being around how questions and uncovering novel mechanisms. And key to this phase of data collection in general is the idea of sampling for range. So you're trying to see all types. Of once you're in, once I was in the hospital setting, realizing, okay, I have nurses and patient care technicians, I have day shifts, evening shifts, night shifts, I have people of different demographic backgrounds, and making sure in your sampling you have enough data of people in each kind of cell as you're sampling to understand the full story. and viewing each interview, each shadowing session as a new case. And in particular, when you talk to someone or you do a shadowing experience where you realize that this is different than what you were expecting, or it's not confirming what you initially thought, that's actually really exciting, a person to help you understand and deepen your theory to figure out, well, why is that the case, and kind of go forward there. Let's see. And the key being around stopping when you've reached saturation, meaning sort of you're really just not learning anything new around when you'd stop data collection. I've employed longitudinal and comparative designs. I think it's nice to have both, that often when you're doing field work, you're there for a long time, so you can, especially if, say, a change is coming, trying to get data before or after, or at least understand the trajectory of what you're examining, doing more of a comparative focus again on success or failure, and thinking really carefully about from the beginning and after, the importance of doing those early memos to understand puzzles and possible areas that are also puzzles for theory, to systematically track a common unit of analysis and outcome associated with it. And I'll walk you through what I ended up using for my dissertation research around examining how mental health providers handled and addressed similar kinds of conflicts with commanders related to getting support for the recommendations for soldier mental health usage. And key to this, and I've learned this in all my projects, is early on thinking about what ideally more objective outcome data you can have access to, so that if you uncover some interesting process, you can track it and link it somehow to outcome data. The idea of, why is your process you're studying of consequence? So thinking early on, orienting around outcomes in the world that you want to explain and dig into. Let's see. All right, and I'm just gonna take a second to make sure, see if I can see the chat while I have it big. I still can't. All right. Chris, I'm just gonna count on you to interrupt me if there's a question. I'm really sorry, I'm not able to figure out how to see the chat while I'm sharing this PowerPoint.
No problem.
Okay, great. All right, so going into an overview of my dissertation study briefly, and then the top challenges and lessons learned around data collection. So for my dissertation, I studied issues in the U.S. Army around mental health care delivery, and I've had 2 papers come out from that work. I'm going to briefly talk about the first one. And so, as many of you might have read about in the news, over the last 15 years, there's been a dramatic increase in soldier mental health problems, most notably post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide related to the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And sort of a surprising early finding when I was in the field is that the Army genuinely invested in trying to improve soldier mental health, that there was billions of dollars spent on this, a dedicated mental health clinic built for every brigade across the Army. Leaders at all levels were required reading around suicide prevention for the first time, screenings, any kind of obvious thing you could think of, and embedding care in primary care, screenings right when you get off the plane, you name it, they had tried it. There was really this sense that there was this broader superordinate goal at the top and communicated down around not just fielding a mission-ready force, but a mentally healthy mission-ready force, that those 2 goals should go together. But yet through this fieldwork, one of the puzzles I kind of uncovered was that there was a lot of failure around achieving this goal for a really long time, and that through my own work, kind of realizing that this came down to conflict between 2 key professional groups that were critical to enabling soldiers to actually use all the mental health services provided. That in the Army context, for a soldier to miss work to get care, or if there are care recommendations about, say, sitting out a stressful training exercise that a mental health provider makes, the Army commander can override that recommendation and say, oh, they're faking it, or oh, I don't believe them, or this mission's too important. It created a lot of tension with each group focusing on the one piece of the superordinate goal and privileging one part of it. So Army commanders privileging the mission readiness goals, and mental health providers privileging soldiers' long-term health and wellness, and really both groups seeing these goals as zero-sum. The commanders feeling, every time I lose a soldier to mental health, they're missing work time during the day. It's degrading our troops' ability to accomplish our mission. And those commanders are evaluated, this is at the company level, every month on the percentage of their unit that is cleared, trained, has passed certain training milestones and medically cleared to deploy. So a lot of conflict emerging between these groups, but it wasn't just about the rational pursuit of different goals. It was also about identity, that these, and such that the conflict was personal, that there were signs of what the literature says, describes as intractable identity conflict, that commanders saw themselves as warriors, mental health providers saw themselves as experts, commanders would stereotype mental health providers as Berkeley hippies, and providers would stereotype commanders as bullies, that they spoke different language, all the acronyms in the Army, and then all the clinical language, different demographic profiles that made it especially difficult for these two groups to get along, and for mental health providers to be influential with commanders, to be listened to, so that their recommendations would actually be followed. And then at the time I had gotten there, they talked about sort of a decade of pretty deep animosity between mental health and commanders. And my research question in this paper is how and when can subunits comprising professional groups with differing identities develop integrative solutions to goal conflict? And in terms of my data collection here, so I was part of an interdisciplinary team when I was at MIT doing this work, working as a research assistant the first year, where I was traveling around with this systems engineering team, looking at patient flows from inpatient to outpatient, sitting in on all these meetings with interviews from everyone from privates on up to generals, to then everyone on the mental health side as sort of a note taker and helping put together reports. And so as part of that project, I got to spend significant time at 4 different posts. And then after this year of kind of preliminary field work, broke off to do my own dissertation study for 1.5 years, where I went back to each of these posts, in addition at the time getting through this broader project to travel to other posts abroad and the Pentagon, places like that, to help kind of contextualize my understanding. And with every site, like figuring out how to actually get access is so key. And for me, it was through being an RA on this incredible project that then helped open the doors to build the trust and have the relationships to be able to break off and design a dissertation on my own to do a deep dive. And for this particular paper, and I'll talk about this later on in the challenges, that one challenge of this kind of research approach is that I've done over 300 interviews, I have all this background knowledge, and there's a holistic story, but then you have to chunk it into papers. Unless you write a book, that that it can be tricky and challenging about what you cut off. And for this paper, I chose to just use data from post 2. As I note in the paper in the appendix, the same pattern holds across all the posts, but this post, because of how well matched the clinics and brigades were, allowed me to do more of a matched case analysis to more convincingly illustrate the mechanism at play that was also at play at the other units. But this critical to this was figuring out with my data collection, what's my unit of analysis going to be around comparing, and it turns out to be comparing how providers and commanders and different mental health clinics resolve similar types of conflicts. So the conflicts were the unit of analysis. And just to give you an example of what I was analyzing, this is one fairly common kind of conflict around whether a mental health provider, what recommendation they should make when a soldier is presenting with anxiety, in this case, having anxiety, panic attacks when inside of a tank due to a prior trauma. The soldier, for his career and not wanting to let his unit down, wants to go on this month-long important combat simulation training. But there's a question about whether it would be made sense for where they were in their recovery. The mental health perspective is, privileging the long-term health and wellness of this patient, where the commanders privileging the goal of mission readiness, that this unit needs to be fully trained on short notice. The soldier's career and unit are counting on them to deploy, or they otherwise would hurt unit readiness or ineligibility. And what was really interesting was the different ways these kind of similar conflicts were handled across clinics. So what I found was on clinics A clinics associated with brigades A and B, most of these conflicts were resolved in sort of lose-lose type ways, or when one party was happy, one wasn't. And a lot of times the providers would say, this soldier absolutely should not go on this training exercise. And the commander would say, oh, well, I think that's a bad recommendation. I'm taking them anyway, and sort of not follow the recommendations. Versus in clinic C and D, these same conflicts were often resolved in ways where both the provider and the commander thought the outcome was positive and the recommendation of the provider actually was followed. But here they were working out these very creative solutions that were more characterized as sort of win-win outcomes, where in this particular case, instead of saying the soldier just hands down can't go and the commander bringing them anyway, the provider, because of, and I'll tell you more about this, but deep understanding of the unit and the type of training exercise said, they can go, but they need to be discreetly assigned to a different role. They cannot be in tanks. They need to come back after 2 weeks to check in with me. We're going to have an embedded mental health person who's out there check in on them. Let's use this as an opportunity to further their therapy through, in this case, the idea of prolonged exposure therapy, to see how this person does and use it to assess whether it's time actually for a medical discharge, honorable discharge from the Army or not, or, but in alignment with the soldier's career goals and in ways that then the commander would get on board with the recommendation. And the big difference between these units, and this is something again that held across all 18 units, but in the clinics where they weren't working out these sort of creative integrative solutions to these conflicts, the way they had structured the clinic was that it was very operationally effective in terms of whichever soldier walked in the door, they would see the first available mental health provider. But this meant that providers would work with all units within a brigade. A unit usually has about 600 soldiers in a brigade of 3,600 soldiers, working with about 36 plus commanders. Where in clinic C and D, very same clinics, same kind of distance from the unit, soldiers could walk in, but they assigned points of contact so that a provider was assigned to one, at most 2 units, working with 6 to 12 commanders such that they could actually develop what I call personalized relationships, take one another's perspective. It was no longer, Captain Smith, but John, who has this important mission to build bridges in Afghanistan, and understanding one another in a way that broke down some of that long-term stereotyping that had been going on, but really critically, and I end up describing this mechanism as anchored personalization, that these providers work surrounded by their professional colleagues in the clinic. They met regularly, that they kept one another grounded from getting too caught up in the goals of command, of sort of mission readiness goals of commanders, that allowed them to be in the space of creativity to develop these integrative solutions. And I also, in this project, had a third comparison group of some providers who would get fully embedded in the brigades and would be uniformed and deploy with these brigades. And after about a year in the field, they tended to sometimes become co-opted and getting too caught up in not having that kind of anchoring. So I also draw on that in this example here. And then in terms of the second paper, so the second paper was really an attempt to use all my data and dig into actually some of those kind of negative cases where even in clinic C and D there, I had a few providers who still didn't develop positive relationships, influential relationships with commanders, personalized relationships, despite being in a structure that promoted it. And that was the case across all, of the 8 other clinics that adopted the same anchored personalization structure as C and D at post 2, I had 6 other clinics like that. And so for this paper, I used as my unit of analysis provider commander dyads, and mapped out their relational history and the extent to which providers' recommendations were followed or not. And this paper is really about, how when you're an expert, you have the expertise, but you're in a low power peripheral role, how can you develop influential relationships with someone in a higher power line manager role to regularly elicit their cooperation? And so just briefly in terms of the main finding here is around this concept of rapid relationality, that I was really fascinated by all the medical expertise related things these providers would do to build influential relationships with commanders. So, you know, joining the unit for push-ups, learning their language and jargon when they would interact with them, and develop this model of the different phases about getting in, doing some big commitment gesture to prove yourself, and then maintaining the relationship as this lower power party, with a really interesting pattern in the data related to timing, where sometimes even a provider so skilled and experienced at building these relationships would spectacularly fail and have a commander like B here who would disregard their recommendations. And when I would analyze the relational history, realize that was often when an early conflict occurred before the provider had sometimes even had a chance to introduce themselves and have that early positive first early interactions before one of these big conflicts that often related to, you know, affecting the commander's unit readiness sometimes would occur, versus when these conflicts would occur after getting through these different phases of the rapid relationality process. The relationship sort of was buffered from these conflicts. Sometimes the conflict would even deepen the relationship, and providers would maintain their influence. And so now I want to briefly go through some of the top challenges and lessons learned from doing this dissertation study. And the first was really just the incredible challenge of learning a new context, that I'm a civilian without a background in the military, that, you know, I was sort of thrown in once I gained access to this project. You know, it was 2 weeks later, I was at my first Army installation. And so, you know, and I've done this with all my projects, but I'm big on, you know, I made flashcards of all the Army ranks. I'm watching documentaries. I'm reading, you know, The Army for Dummies. I'm watching different shows about the military. I'm trying to, and I did this with the nursing study too, in my current, my other studies, but really immersing yourself to learn the language, learn the acronyms. That my interviews are so much more effective once I knew the acronyms. That, you know, I learned when talking to commanders, often shorter, direct sentences were best. So just saying, you know, how's SHARP going? And, you know, that's their sexual assault program. How's this? Like knowing the acronyms, being very direct, but that takes a lot of kind of deep background work on understanding the context and a lot of kind of homework behind the scenes. Critical is finding, you know, so finding friends who are veterans or active duty, or in this case, being part of this team was so wonderful. And especially my main mentor and committee member, Jayakana Srinivasan, on this project for the Army work stream, who I could regularly ask kind of confidentially things that were confusing me, or kind of those basic questions that you don't want to be asking to the people who you're studying to possibly lose credibility with, checking my understanding, you know, what he would call, you know, does it pass the sniff test around whether this, what I'm proposing or seeing or certain subdynamics made sense. And the final thing around here is sort of being nice to yourself, and, you know, ideally with any project, giving yourself a little bit of pre-pilot time to experiment, make mistakes, and adjust from them. I mean, the number of mistakes I made that very first trip were just astounding. You know, everything from, you know, the general comes in the room, you're supposed to stand, and when they sit, you sit, and I was always sort of a beat off, so I'd be standing when everyone's sitting, or vice versa, and having to kind of recover and like learn the hard way about the decorum and the culture of the field site that you're within. I put up there sort of, I always, for most of my projects, do some kind of glossary about all the terminology to help you know, to help myself learn the jargon and the acronyms and the expressions, which are very plentiful in the military, but kind of giving yourself that time to adjust. And this is also as you're fine-tuning your interview protocol and the way to ask things, and having enough time to work out the kinks, so that when you really kind of figure out what you want to focus on, you've done all this background that can help you hit the ground running when you have that opportunity. In this case, it was when I finally got permission to break off and do my own deeper dive for my dissertation work, that I was able to use all I had learned in that year beforehand. For me, the second challenge was just handling overwhelming amounts of data. And I think for any project, once you learn about it, there's so, you know, in this case, all the levels of the medical hierarchy and the different types. And then within the Army, there's all these different levels and ranks and units. There's different types of installations around the world. There's so much. And I think what I learned was the importance of being broad at first, but then focusing in after going broad. So realizing everything that's out there. But then for me, it was what helped me focus was realizing what matters most for a soldier to actually benefit from these mental health services. And that's where I kind of realized it was so much of that decision was at the company commander level. And had to do with outpatient mental health providers, that for a soldier to really benefit required the support of that company level commander, buying into the recommendations, being supportive. And so that's what kind of helped me focus when I could have studied so many other things, or the inpatient psych wards, but I chose strategically to go there. But it took some kind of memoing and really thinking about how to focus that way. The other challenge was managing multiple sites and groups. Each post, is different geographically, different, somewhat different jargon and identities. The commanders and mental health providers were also so different. And so figuring out, for example, my own self-presentation around, as I mentioned before, when interviewing the commanders, being more direct with mental health providers, figuring out how you're being perceived by them, and to, I think being associated with MIT was a real kind of feather in my cap that made people sort of trust me more than perhaps if I come, than if I was where I'm at right now, being at Yale perhaps, but really, kind of figuring out that for different groups, you need slightly different approaches in terms of how your self-presentation, just staying organized, that I would buy different color notebooks for different posts to try to, in my office and have the stacks of different things, but really making sure you're not mixing up what data comes from what unit, but that you use kind of like physical markers to help separate those. Another challenge is around making sure you're being strategic about getting the data you need to address the animating puzzles of what you're doing. So, as I was realizing that this command provider interface was so important and these conflicts, making sure, I'm speaking to at least one commander from every unit in each brigade. I'm talking to the majority of mental health providers, so I can feel like I can convincingly make grounded statements about what a certain mental health clinic was like, that I spent time physically in each clinic, hanging out in the waiting room, sitting in on a team meeting, and kind of figuring out the kind of coverage that I needed to be able to, meaningfully write about why dynamics were differing in these different clinics and brigades. For the rapid relationality paper, once I sort of realized that dyads were important, that it was making sure I was matching up these dyads and figuring out the right way to approach that, and getting my interview protocol enough data to map out these relational histories, to have questions about, like, bring me back to the very first time you met. What, how are you feeling? Walk me through that. Like that I really, I wasn't physically present for each time these groups met, but needed to get enough data and triangulated data to feel like I could make grounded claims about it. And the fifth one, I realize I'm going a little over here, is around addressing alternative explanations while you have access to the site. That I've seen some people get into trouble where you're not really presenting what you're finding until you kind of have it wrapped up with a bow on it. And I've learned that, that can really be a mistake, that it's great to present early and often, and to tough critics who are going to say, oh, it's probably because of this that you saw these better outcomes, and that you still have access to actually look into those alternatives. Finding people who I call switchers, so someone, say, who worked in Unit A and then moved to Unit C, and understanding their experience can be really helpful to understand, well, is it actually just about the personality of the people here, or did their behavior change when they switched? Seeking out, being kind of excited when somebody is not conforming to your emerging model of what's happening, that can often deepen your theorizing. That, my whole second paper on rapid relationality came out of those few cases where even a provider in that anchored personalization structure was still not establishing an influential relationship. And so digging into that just to understand why, led to a whole other paper and project, and kind of being open throughout about, being open to other plausible reasons for the different outcomes you might be observing. So with that, I will stop and turn over to questions. So thank you.
There have not been any questions so far, but yeah, are there any follow-up questions now? I think you may have stunned us all into because this, I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, this looks like it was really difficult.
No, let's see. Yeah, no, I mean, and I can also talk about now challenges with this new COVID project I'm doing being all virtual. Though I think I see now I've figured out how to get the chat. Let's see. There we go. Oh, no, I lost one.
So there was one about how to identify the unit of analysis in the very beginning of a qualitative study, and should we have a specific research question in mind?
Yeah, I'd say the beginning should always be very exploratory and really driven by like problems of those people to those people you're studying, and and giving yourself time to deeply get into that, and then ideally after a few months, that's when you step back and say that, write some theory memos about like, well, what, is this about conflict, emotional labor, change, like what would these literatures have to say about the dynamics I'm seeing? And that's where in conjunction with possible realizing where the theoretical gaps are, that's often then when I'll think about a unit of analysis and say, well, if I really want to understand how soldiers, whether the recommendations are followed, I need to understand before that, like these decision points about the recommendations that providers make. So maybe that could be a unit of analysis. It's often not, fully it is this organic kind of growing thing and checking in with people. The research question in my experience always comes much later with this kind of work based on your theoretical framing. To me, I always just keep it empirical for the beginning. It's questions of like, how do we resolve these conflicts? How do providers who don't have authority have influence? That was kind of my working question for a long time. And then it's later on engaging with the literature and saying, well, what does issue selling have to say about this? What does upward influence have to say about this? It's sort of a later on kind of thing, but it is so hard, but I think doing earlier thinking on that can just help you so that later on you don't say, oh, I want to write about this, but I just don't have the data.
So there was another question about narrowing down provisional research questions, but I think you answered it.
Okay.
So there's another question. Did you ever have anyone refuse to talk to you? How did you deal with exclusion or rejection in your site?
That's interesting. So I luckily didn't have too much of that. I think the hierarchy of the military makes it so that if your boss says this person's coming and they want to do an interview, your commander says that. Usually what would happen is sometimes commanders, especially, like the mental health side, people took a lot of, there was a lot of empathy because most of them had to do research studies themselves and dissertations. But on the command side, sometimes I would get the response, okay, I have 10 minutes. And so then it was up to me to turn that 10 minutes into an hour, hour and a half, or a follow-up phone interview through over time, kind of learning how to handle myself in those interviews and make it relevant to them. But then of course it's sometimes people not writing you back. I on the provider side, I was pretty good. On the command side, luckily I had a lot more options. I think for me, it's just in terms of thinking of my sampling spreadsheet, I just wanted to make sure there were no systematic holes where it's like, oh, every brigade, the sustainment people are always ignoring you. Like that's an issue. I need to make sure I've talked to someone in a sustainment unit for each company for each battalion. So things like that.
So another question is about, can you talk about helping people that are not familiar with your methods understand what you were doing during the publication process?
let's see, during the publication process. So, I mean, I think usually I take my best stab first at the empirical puzzle, what theoretical lens I think best fits my data and is truest to it. And then you kind of send it out and see if the reviewers agree with you or not. And you know, I've had it go different ways. In the anchored personalization paper, the framing radically changed, but I think in ways way for the better. That I had one reviewer who was saying this is all about goal conflict, and another reviewer saying this is about identity. And at first I thought, I don't know if I can, you know, it was a high risk. I don't know if I should send this back. But then as I read the literatures they suggested, I realized, oh my gosh, both of, you know, the goal conflict people really haven't thought about identity. The identity people haven't thought about org design and structure affecting how identity conflicts can be resolved, where the goal conflict literature has with these kind of integrative mechanisms, co-location. So it actually, through engaging with the reviews and this different way of seeing my data, I think I was able to, build a richer theory and theory that even fit the data better. But it is, I think, you know, a challenge with this kind of inductive work where it, you know, it can be a case of many things, and that it's a bit of a social process, which one in print it ends up being.
So speaking of a social process, there's a question: what helps with rapid relationality in your current virtual field work?
Oh my gosh, we're we're trying to figure that out. It's a lot of it we're still, I mean, maybe this is a part two, trying to figure out, because there's certain occupational groups we're studying, emergency departments, and now the broader COVID unit, and that's broken into, you know, attendings, residents, advanced practice physicians like nurse practitioners and PAs, nurses, techs. And so sometimes we'll get great response from one group, like the residents, but then the techs, we don't hear from at all. And so we've been trying, you know, we tried to do like a random sampling to make people feel special for being randomly chosen, versus earlier on, we were trying some snowball sampling to you've been personally recommended. We've tried building relationships with people in positions of authority, but that can also backfire when you realize if a team doesn't respect their leader and your leader supports your study, then no one's going to want to talk to you. And so luckily the hospitals that we're studying is so big, I think we're getting many second tries and chances, but it has been much more challenging in terms of the earlier issue around some people not wanting to talk to you, and of course being sensitive to the incredible demands on people right now too that can be, you know, part of this. But you know, we're finding, you know, we've tried to donate food to the units and little gifts, like we're trying lots of things, but it's much more challenging, and I don't think we've completely figured it out yet, but hopefully we'll continue to learn.
And then there's a few people who asked kind of related questions that are all about, you know, how you make these decisions. So for example, how do you decide how many interviews to do? How do you decide when you should return? How do you decide how long to be there? And how do you decide how long the interview should be?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think it goes back to that idea of saturation when you're not learning anything new. Like you could have a half-hour interview. Well, it's interesting too. I think once you've figured out what you're really focused on, you might do an interview where you're not learning a lot, but you need more cases of whatever it is. So that actually can happen too. I mean, I think earlier, like what I was saying, once I learned I was going to be doing a deep dive, I was going to do a deep dive on these certain clinics and brigades, I knew I needed coverage of at least a certain number of commanders from each of those subunits. I needed to feel like I talked, you know, to talk to the majority of mental health providers in a clinic to make any kind of claims about it. Usually with the interviews, I kind of let the person I'm talking to dictate that, you know, like if they want to talk to me for 3 hours, we'll talk for 3 hours, or we'll set up a part 2 on the phone. That's actually another thing. Part 2 phone interviews I found can be very illuminating, where the first interview, especially if it's cold, and like this was a colder project than my nursing project where I was more embedded in the unit, where this is, you know, meeting someone for the first time as a stranger. And so the idea of they met me in person the first time and then we followed up on the phone and we could go deeper, so that approach has worked well. But, you know, often if someone wants to talk to me and has things to say, I'll let them kind of drive it. But I think it also depends on once you've focus on the puzzles that you're most interested on. It's just getting as much as your time allows you to get.
Well, it is noon, so we need to wrap up. I'll alert you to a few questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, but I did want to thank you so much, and thank you, of course, to all of our participants who took the 2 hours today to participate in this consortium. I really appreciate it, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And again, thank you to all of our presenters today who took the time out of their busy schedules.
No, my pleasure. It was a lot of fun. And I have my email there too if people want to follow up that way as well. So thanks.
Hey, if I can just get a final word in before we close on behalf of Karma, thanks to everybody for joining the event and for the participants for your contributions, Chris for your hosting. Let me remind you first of all that the recording of last week's session is available, and I think that information has been forwarded to you. If not, we will get it to you. We post these freely accessible materials on our Karma YouTube channel, and so we'll make sure that you have access to both of these. Let me also remind you, or make sure that you know, that we have 4 new short courses that are coming up the week of July 6th. These are live and online. They are targeted for our Asia region, but they are really accessible time-wise to several locations throughout the world, and we've got a nice Karma global time schedule. So we have courses on questionnaire design, advanced data analysis with R, introduction to structural equation modeling, and grounded theory. Those are 5 days, 4 hours a day. And everybody gets the member discount rate, and also there's a professional association rate. So the bottom line is, I think the price for students is $300 for the short course. So you can find information on the Karma webpage about that. So email me or email Karma if we can help in any way, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, Chris. I'll let you have the final word.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and also, yeah, of course, thank you to Larry and Karma for always hosting this. It's very generous on their part for doing that. I appreciate it. And we will see you for the next session. Thanks again. If you have questions that were not answered by Julia, like she said, feel free to email her, and I'm sure she'll respond when she can. Thanks so much.